This talk is based on the book that just came out in 2014, but there's still lots of questions that the book left, and so that's in part what I'm going to talk about today. And so here's the contemporary, the standard view of social mobility in the world can actually be portrayed on one diagram. And so we have here the correlation in earnings across generations, typically fathers to sons, and then the Gini coefficient on income, which is a measure of the inequality of the society. And what this picture shows is a number of different things. One is that there's no constancy to this correlation. And that seems to say that societies play a big role in determining the strength of inheritance of characteristics from fathers to sons. That biology can't be that important. And also, if you look at places like Norway and Sweden, there's actually a very low correlation in characteristics, earnings characteristics between fathers and sons. And so again, it's arguing that nature is not playing very big a role. And we also see then that some societies, such as Peru and Brazil, have very strong intergenerational correlations and also high degrees of inequality. And so the conventional view then of social mobility is that it's actually surprisingly fast, measured by things like earnings or wealth or education. And if there's a stable structure to variation in earnings, this would imply that in somewhere like Scandinavia, only 4% of the variance of earnings would actually be explained from inheritance. The 96% is coming from randomness or something else. Okay? And that even in the United States, only 22% of the variance in earnings can actually be explained by inheritance, and that the world really is built anew in each generation to a surprising degree. It also implies that there is a social mobility problem. Mobility rates are presumably too low in some societies, because if in Scandinavia, which are highly functional economies, can achieve these very high rates of social mobility, it must imply that in Brazil, there are a lot of people of potential talent and ability who are trapped in occupations or jobs that don't maximize their potential, right? And that there really is this social mobility problem, and that culture, human capital, and social connections are much more important in transmitting status than biology. Okay? And so that seemed to be the state of the art on mobility, but it turns out that even within conventional measures, there are indications that we're missing something about the nature of social mobility, because what happens is that even on conventional measures, if you include status information about grandparents or even great-grandparents, those always turn out to be predictive of the status of children. And so it implies that there's a more complex pattern going on here in terms of the inheritance of status in society, that even when you control for parents, grandparents are predictive, and it's also true aunts and uncles are also predictive. Great-grandparents, indeed, in one study have been shown to also be predictive. And so it says that the picture of social mobility that we have, there's something more complex going on. It's not just your parents that matter. And what this book does is turn to surnames as a way of measuring the pattern and the rate of social mobility over many generations. And what happens here is that all of us, typically in the society, have a surname that places us within a surname lineage, right? And it can be a very uninformative name like Clark, okay? But also there are names that are highly informative, right? And so one of the ones I use in England actually tend to be very rare surnames. And so, for example, the name Pepys is actually a name where we think every descendant came from one farming family in England in the 15th century, right? And you're able to trace then the male line of descent of people with that name over the course of 500 years, right? And so the idea of surnames is that it economizes on information because we don't need to know the exact linkages, but we can still tell that everyone in that lineage is descending from the same starting point. And it turns out for England, the first surnames actually appeared with the Norman conquest of 1066. And so there are a set of surnames in England, it's only about 0.4% of the population, which have distinctively Norman origin. And so names like Beaumont, Montgomery, Vernon, Villiers, these all can be traced back to the Norman conquest. And so you could say, well, what happened to the descendants of the Normans in England? And there are other names. For example, there's 200 people in England now have the names Arblaster and Alabaster. And those both stem from the medieval occupation Arbalestarius, which was crossbowmen. And no one who had these names in 600 years later knew what these names meant. And so that's why a lot of names actually will then modify, and actually, but they're still traceable. So the name Cowherd, for example, is from cowherd in the medieval period. It doesn't refer to your personal characteristics. And so, as I say, you can actually trace, as I say, these lineages through time. And this is true not just of England, but of many other societies. And I'd say this was the interesting family, the Pepys family, which has an interesting history of distinction over the course of 500 years. There's only 12 Pepys left in England now, but 4 of them are doctors. And so that's actually a surprising kind of preservation of status over this, given what we saw in the first chart, where it seems that all status should disappear fairly quickly. And so based on current mobility measures, common surnames should rapidly lose status information. And in any society, within 2 or 3 or 4 generations, all common surnames should have the same average status. Because with a lot of social mobility, that original information just disappears. So the rate at which surnames lose their status or move towards average status is measuring the rate of social entropy. And so it's actually a very nice, you can translate that then very nicely into a measure of the rate of social mobility within any society. And as I say, with the advantage that in somewhere like England, we can literally look at this over 20 generations and look at the comparative rate over this time, and then also what's happening in this very long run. And one thing about surnames, though, is that they trace just one line of descent, and so they're tracing the patriline. And so you might worry that that line of descent might have more fidelity to status than other lines do. So one of the things that we're now working on that's not in the book is to actually calculate how assortative mating was in England back to 1800. And so what we can do in the 19th century is we look at the characteristics of husbands of women, because the husband's the one who have the actual explicit status, and look at that compared to the brothers of women. And what you find is that there's a very close matching. And that even in this society where women didn't have measures of education, often didn't carry a lot of wealth, they are matching up very closely to men that are the equivalent of their brothers. And there's no sign that assortativeness in mating has in any sense increased in somewhere like England, even with the rise of women's education. And so there has been this popular idea that we're moving towards a more assortative society, a more kind of class-based society, because women now have very explicit marks of social status, such as earnings, education. But actually the evidence for pre-industrial England is that already you had a society which is matching very closely. And it turns out that the rates of social mobility I derive here couldn't possibly be biologically based unless there's very, very high degree of assortativeness in mating. And so that's another way of testing whether biology could potentially play much role. And so in the book then, we have all of these studies from the various societies, England, Sweden, United States, all across the world, using surnames. And what is startling that emerges when we actually start grouping people by surnames is that the intergenerational correlation on status on any measure of status for surnames is very high, and is between 0.7 and 0.8. And the other startling thing is there's little variation across societies and epochs. That to a first approximation, status seems to be passed, measured using surnames, at a very constant rate. It's the same for all status measures, whether we use wealth, earnings, education, occupation, or even longevity, right? All of these things seem to be passed at the same rate. It seems to be the same roughly across the status distribution. It's the same at the top of social status and at the bottom, right? And this is just measuring how fast people are returning towards average status for groups of people, right? And so at the same rate at the top and the bottom. The majority of social status measured in this way then is determined at conception, because if you square this number, it tells you the share of the variance that's going to be accounted for in a stable distribution by inheritance, and so it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 65%. And the evidence seems to be that it's impossible to change this substantially by government interventions. And what I'm going to show you is, for example, Sweden has the same low rate of social mobility now that it had in the 18th century. And it's the same in Sweden as it is in England, which has much less government interventions in terms of education and welfare provision for poorer families. And that one of the things this leads to is that it's not easily possible to rule out genetics as actually being the main carrier of social status, the thing that's distinguishing people. And here, as I say, here's one just way of presenting the picture. Here's the surname estimates from 1950 to 2012, and then here's the conventional estimates for these different societies. And it's just a very different picture, particularly in someone like Sweden. So that's why it's interesting to look at Sweden. Okay? And the book says, well, why are the conventional results and the surname results so different? And here the idea is that conventional estimates focus on individual aspects of status, right? And so typically we say, well, what's earnings in one generation, earnings in the next? What's education in one generation, education in the next? And what the surnames are actually doing is they're capturing a deeper kind of latent variable of status. And basically they're capturing, provocatively we would call it a kind of status genotype that is strongly and faithfully passed from generation to generation, whereas these other measures are looking at aspects of the phenotype of people, and that there's going to be a lot of randomness connecting that phenotype to this underlying genotype, and that it carries these predictions then about what status movements will look like across generations. And so the simple model that is formulated in the book is that if YIT is some measure of status, education or earnings, that it's going to be composed of this underlying kind of status genotype plus some randomness. And that status genotype, which is measured with mean 0, is being quite faithfully transmitted from one generation to the other, but again with some randomness thrown in. And that's all you need in order to explain the phenomena of the inheritance of social status. That this simple kind of structure can actually account for everything that we observe about social status. There's a surprisingly kind of simple law, right, of kind of social mobility. And so the idea is that all of us carry within us some inherent social status which may not be manifested, right? Because there's going to be a lot of luck that determines where we end up in the social distribution. But when we look at the children of people, this is going to be the predictor of the outcomes for the children. And when I talked about this to some people at Davis, they said, oh, breeding value. That's simply what it is in biology, right? And so this model essentially says that all of us have this kind of effectively a breeding value, the predicted value of our progeny, and that to tell what that is, you'd have to look at the entire lineage of people. And that we could actually infer from the lineage what your likely value was, right? And so that societies which match up based on lineage are actually matching up in terms of the maximizing the potential outcomes for the children, right? And that, in fact, if people want high-status children now in this society, they should, instead of going to match.com, they should actually be going to ancestry.com, because the histories of people will actually reveal what the likely outcomes are for the children, right? And so that there are some people who are down on their luck, but come from a lineage where it's predictable that the children are likely to rise again in the next generation, and that you don't just look at the phenotype, you have to look at the underlying kind of lineage of people. And so as I say, it's a very simple model. Let me show how this works in practice. And so here, the first example is, here's some rare surnames in England in 1858. And those surnames were chosen, some of them are very wealthy, some of them are wealthy, and some of them are poor. And I just put them up like this because I want to illustrate that it's not obvious, right? And these are surnames held by 40 or less people. And so for most people in the society would not know, looking at these surnames, which is which. And it turns out these ones are very wealthy, these are moderately wealthy, and these ones are the poor ones. You're right. One of the things you'll see with some of these, this is a family of bankers with the great name, the Biggs. This is a famous, one French emigre founded that entire family, and everyone in England is a descendant of that one guy, and there's now about 50 or 60 people with that name. And then a lot of these names are, because they're rare, are either Sephardic Jewish in England or are Huguenot origin, right? And so Basafi, I think, is Jewish. Amuti is Jewish. I don't see the Huguenot ones. But some of them are just perfectly ordinary English names that just somehow had relatively kind of odd spelling. And so a name like Big, B-I-G-G, is not rare. But adding the E on the end makes it a very rare name. And what you can then see with these families is we can measure their average wealth all the way down to the present. And this is measured, the log of wealth relative to average wealth in the society as a whole. And what you see is that the richest families, as a group, stay the richest. But they're moving towards the mean, but they're moving at this very steady rate. The second richest group, and then these are the poorest group, and they turn out to be not that far from the mean. It's hard to identify really poor people with these measures because there's just a lot of people in the society that have zero wealth. And to find the really poor is difficult. But you'll see that there is this kind of stately progression, but it does mean that 5 generations later, these families are still relatively wealthy, and the prediction will be that they will not be within 10% of average wealth for something like another 5 generations, right? And that the process of social mobility, the interesting thing is that it's very consistent, but it's slow within the society, and it's moving very slowly. And what is interesting then is that we can also, for these people, go back to the records and find the individual genealogy and the individual linkages for all of these people. And what you find is that the individual wealth correlation is actually right in the order that you would expect from modern data, right? But it's just at the group level that the correlation is actually much lower. And what that is implying is that within these families, if you have a wealthy father and your wealth drops a lot, the prediction is that for your children, it'll rise again. Right? And so that's why at the group level, it seems like you're oscillating around a trend that's moving very slowly towards the mean. And that deviations, as I say, will be correcting, will be self-correcting, that somehow these families know that they belong to this rich group and that they're actually moving again back towards the mean. So there's a lot of random variation within these families, but there's also this consistent high level of wealth that's being kind of maintained across time. And as I say, this is not just wealth. It turns out for these same people, we can look them up in the records of education. And one measure we have is just who went to Oxford or Cambridge. It's the top 1% of the English educational elite. And these families are heavily overrepresented in the 19th century in that group, and they're still heavily overrepresented now. And you can actually calculate from their rate of overrepresentation again, what their implied average educational status is. And it turns out that that is moving towards the mean at a rate that's very similar of that of wealth as well. And so it just turns out that there is this kind of, typically in these societies, a kind of, if you're elite on one dimension, you're elite on every dimension. And all of these things are moving towards the mean at relatively similar rates, but very slow. And then once you see this, it's not that surprising if you go back and look at the details of English history. And so for the book, I actually looked up, there's a nice project at Stanford which has the genealogy of the English intellectual elite and shows all of their interconnections by marriage and family. And so you can look up who Darwin's great-great-grandchildren are and what they're doing. And so he had 10 children, but only 27 great-great-grandchildren. So you could see the collapse of fertility amongst these upper classes in the early 20th century. But it turns out that 11 of his great-great-grandchildren are notable enough to either have a Wikipedia page devoted to them or had a Times obituary when they died. But they're all over the place. There's university professors, painters, authors, doctors, conservationists, a film director. And the interesting thing is, I come from the Davis Economics Department. It's the 30th ranked economics department in the United States. Darwin's great-great-grandchildren are more distinguished than my economics department, right? And that, as I say, is quite a persistence in terms of social status that you're actually seeing within the society. And I think this is what's happening in the society as a whole. By the way, included in these great-great-grandchildren is one called Keynes and another one called Huxley. And so that's where you see the interconnection between these kind of intellectual families. But as I say, this is not just at the top of the society. This seems to be a kind of general phenomena. So there's this deeper structure of persistence. It's similar. You can also look at membership in parliament. And again, it shows this same kind of rate of, it's an even more elite club. But again, if you look at the representation of names in parliament, it shows the same underlying slow rate of social mobility. And then another thing we can actually do is examine, with these names, the prehistory of elites, right? And so what we're looking at here is we've assumed that xt plus 1, this underlying thing, is going to be bxt plus e. Now, one thing I should say is, why do the names show the movement of that underlying x? And the answer is that once we group people by name, and we move outside an initial generation where we group people, once we have a large grouping of people by name, the random elements even out and go to 0. And what you just see is the systematic, the x variable, right? The other stuff that connected the y's to the x's, it becomes 0 on average. And so then when we look at that group level, we see the movement of that underlying x. And it's also the case that if you take ethnic groups, you will again see the movement of that underlying x. And so that's why the Jewish population in the United States is regressing only very slowly to the mean. And a lot of people have theorized that this is something to do with particular culture, particular connections. But in terms of this model, that regression to the mean of the Jewish population is exactly what would be predicted by the model. And similarly, the black population is regressing to the mean at a very slow rate. Again, it's not a deviation from this model. And so any time we group people by a way that doesn't look at their idiosyncratic luck in that generation, then you'll actually start seeing the movement, this underlying slow rate of social mobility, right? And so that's why I say the surnames actually then reveal what this underlying process is like. And so what we can ask is, well, what if we went back from time t plus 1 to time t? What would happen in terms of social status? What would we observe? And it turns out that if you were to estimate what b was just empirically, and then estimate what gamma was here, it should be the same number. And so this simple model has the prediction that if I start with an elite and look what happens to them in the future, I'll see them move slowly towards the mean, but it should be absolutely symmetrical, their past. That the way a group of families becomes elite is actually typically by a long process of gradual deviation from the mean. It's just a statistical progress. There's no meaning to it, right? We just observe the ones that happen to be the winners in this random lottery. But it has a predictable effect that elites in any generation will be drawn typically mostly from those who are just below the elite, right? And those just below the elite will typically be drawn from those who are just below them, because the population is denser, right? Everyone's tending to move towards the mean, but there's always these deviations that are necessary, these randomness to keep the distribution. And so it's very predictable then that this is what we should observe. And so with the surname data in England, we could take Oxbridge attendance as the measure of the status of people, and this shows the overrepresentation at Oxford. And then the yellow squares, that represents these rich families that we chose just on grounds of how wealthy they were. And what you see with them is that they move towards the mean with this correlation of 0.77. And then this is their prehistory. And they rose already by 1530. They were somewhat above average in status. And their rise actually occupied 300 years to the point where we observed them. And that correlation over those 300 years is 0.77, right? And so you get this remarkable symmetry that you can actually, at the social level, make these predictions over hundreds of years of where will this group of people be, right? And as I say, this is a surprisingly law-like pattern. And then this other group of people here, the red circles, they were chosen just because they had a rare name and it happened to show up at Oxford or Cambridge in 1800 to 1830. So that was the only thing. Oh, sorry, I got this wrong. This is the rich people, sorry, the ones with the 0.82. The other group was chosen because they happened to show up at Oxford and Cambridge. And what will actually happen is in this first period, they'll have more rapid observed mobility. Because in the first period, when we chose them just because they happened to be at the university, then we'll see people, a lot of people who had good luck. But when we move to the next period, where they're pre-selected, now that group will have average luck. And so now we're observing that underlying X for the group and the average of that X. And that'll be true then for every generation through here and for every generation through here. Okay? And then what you see again, as I say, that's the ones that has this correlation of 0.77. This is a bit higher. It's 0.83. And why it's a bit higher, I don't know, right? I mean, so that's a deviation from the idea that there's just this uniform rate of mobility, but not a huge deviation, right? A relatively modest deviation. So as I say, you get, and this pattern you can observe elsewhere as well, right? And so this is a nice kind of confirmation of the model. And as I say, all that we're doing here is we're just taking their educational status and we're just looking at, assuming there's a normal distribution of status within each group, where's the mean of that status based on what fraction of the group is actually falling above this threshold, right? And so there's no reason why necessarily this would work, but it turns to actually work very well, right, as a way of measuring these. And you don't get a lot of deviations from this idea of a relatively constant rate of social mobility. And so that's England. So here's Sweden as another example. And so Sweden has a number of sets of elite surnames. And so the Swedes actually have a very active aristocracy, which is still very much in place. And where there's the Riddarhuset in downtown Stockholm is the headquarters of the Swedish aristocracy and maintains exact genealogical records of all the families that were ever inducted into the aristocracy. And they also have a differentiation between high aristocrats, counts and barons, and untitled nobility. And so it's all exactly known which are which. And this aristocracy was mainly created by 1800, and it was created in the period when Sweden was a major imperial power in Northern Europe. And so a lot of these were military contractors, organizers of armies, who were rewarded with nobility, and who then often had quite distinct surnames because they would be German, or there's some Scottish ones as well. So Douglas is a Swedish aristocratic surname. Hamilton is a Swedish aristocratic surname. And so these were mercenaries from all across Europe who did well in war and were rewarded in this way. Or they were people from Sweden who, on becoming aristocrats, would typically change their name from the patronyms that changed in every generation into these elaborate names. And so one of the economists in UCLA, who's retired now, is Axel Leijonhufvud. And that's a high Swedish aristocratic name. I think it means lion's foot. And so Gyllenstierna, right? And so there's a couple of actors in the United States now who are again from the Swedish aristocratic background. And Maggie Gyllenhaal, I think, right? That's right. That's again an aristocrat. It means Gyllenstierna, gold star, right? And so you get these names. And then the second thing that happened is that, well, I'll explain that in a second, the Latinized surnames. So this is the headquarters of the Swedish aristocracy. And this is the history of the ennoblement. And so this is the number of families that were created. And as I say, by 1800, they're mostly created. And then the net stock declines because rare names tend to go to extinction. right? If you have only daughters, or if you just have low fertility, then the name will extinguish. But the total number of people with these names is actually still increasing, but the net stock of families has declined. And then here's the examples of the domestic ones, and they're very distinctive within Sweden. No one is going to confuse these. And the nice thing about Sweden is that these names since 1900 have been protected legally. No one else may take these names in Sweden, right? And so in Sweden, the tax authorities maintain a register of surnames, and any change of surname has to be approved by the Swedish tax authorities. And Swedes actually, a lot of them are changing their surnames, and so it also generates, this is the kind of Republican nightmare of, the all-powerful grip of the state. They actually have a name generator, so that if you want to change their name, they'll actually make suggestions. Here's some available names. But you can't now take a name that another family already has in Sweden. And so that there are actually quite strict rules about name changing, unless your own family history includes that name, okay? And so it turns out a lot of Swedes are switching away from names that end in SON, which are low status names. And so those are declining steadily. And things like when on marriage, people can either adopt a new name or take one party's name. But these names are all protected. And then you have this class of Latinized surnames. And so what happened is anyone who went to university in the 17th or 18th or early 19th century, it was quite typical for them to abandon a name like Anderson and instead take on a Latinized name as a mark of their new status. And so these names like Celsius, of course, so a lot of Swedish scientists have these names because this was the mark of the educated class. And so basically you have the aristocrats have distinctive names, and then the educated of the 18th century actually have these names as well. But you have to be careful with these because people are still adopting these names. And so in this study, we make sure that we only took the names that already existed by 1800, right? Because you don't want new recruits coming in, because then you'll seem to have too low a rate of social mobility. And so we've got those classes of names. And the other nice thing about Sweden is that they're very liberal with the publication of information. And so every year in Sweden, private companies publish the amounts of taxable income that people have. And they publish them under the slogan, "Know what your neighbor earns." And this is an example. So here's in Stockholm are all the Lejeune Hufvud's. And this, for 2008, actually shows not just their earned income, but also their capital income as well. And so you can actually see that, well, here's Margareta. She's doing pretty well. Here's her address. And so it's like a burglar's handbook. It must be a low-crime society because, as I say, it actually identifies, and you could check, well, are there any other Lejeune Hufvud's living with this person? And so there's a lot of information. And one of the nice things about that information is then you can actually display, well, what's the distribution of, say, of income amongst people with these different types of names. And the first thing you see is, so here's Anderson, a very low-class name. That's the distribution. And then here's the noble names. And you can see that that distribution is still shifted upwards. And the other nice thing about it is it confirms this idea that there's actually a lot of mobility within the nobility, right? And that there are actually still now poor nobles, but that, well, somehow what's happening is that their distribution is just shifted higher, right? There's much variance, but it's shifted higher, and that the low-class people, again, there's variance, but it's shifted lower, right? And so this actually seems to be a general feature of surnames. And by the way, it's a prediction of that very simple model, that that's what would happen over many generations, right? That if you have a high-status group, that eventually its variance actually will quickly move towards the population variance, but its mean will actually move more slowly towards the population mean. And what if we take doctors in Sweden as representing an elite? What we find is that these names are all still overrepresented amongst doctors. And you can go back to 1900, doctors are listed all the way back. And what you actually see is that that overrepresentation is declining, and on average, the implied intergenerational correlation of status that would apply is about 0.72. And so Sweden is showing very similar slow rates of social mobility to a society like England, right? And there's no sign of any speed up as we move to the present period, right? And so that you really are seeing, again, at the group level, this very slow social mobility. And here's one which is the Swedish Royal Academies. And so they go back all the way to the 18th century. And so here we just mix together the Latinized names, the aristocratic names, and they have, it's an even slower rate of descent amongst the Swedish Royal Academies. And still, these names are 4 times as frequent as they are in the population amongst the Swedish academies. And then you can see again that the Anderson names at the bottom here has still not attained full representation, right? Though as I say, the problem with these names is that people are shifting away from those names, and if it's selective shifting away, then you won't see anything about the rate of social mobility. And so, as I say, the interesting thing is that Sweden also shows these very slow rates of social mobility, measured at least at this kind of group level. And then the summary B estimates for Sweden, we can do it for attorneys, physicians, university students, academicians. They're all very high, these intergenerational correlations. You go back to the years before 1900, they don't seem to be that much higher, if any higher. And so you go from the pre-industrial to the modern era, and you're observing kind of very similar slow rates of social mobility. And as I say, what's remarkable about this is that Sweden really is a society with universal access to education. Preschools, there's very widespread access to these. There's universal medical care. There's quite generous income supports. There's a big debate in Denmark recently, which is very similar in characteristics, the debate about lazy Robert, who's a guy who hasn't worked in 10 years and doesn't plan to ever work again, and says he's very grateful to be in a society where you don't need to work. And it turns out he's living a perfectly happy life. And the debate was, well, should we continue to allow this, right? And it's just illustrative of the fact that there are these kind of generous supports within these societies. And so as I say, what's interesting is that it hasn't seemed to do anything to change rates of social mobility. And so that brings us to the more fundamental question, assuming this is true, as I say, of all these different societies, which is what's transmitting that social genotype across generations? And so economists would tend to focus on the idea of human capital, that it's the training, the care, and the attention that goes into children that transmits from the parents to the children either high or low status, okay? I think anthropologists would be more interested in culture as a transmitter of this. And then some people, of course, even amongst anthropologists, would wonder about, well, what about the genetic connection between generations? And one of the things we can say about resources is that one problem they have is that they're observable. We need something that's not very strongly observable, because at the observable level, we're seeing relatively rapid mobility. I mean, rich families become a lot less richer. High-income families become a lot less high income. And so if that's the true carrier of social status, then we shouldn't be seeing this kind of slower underlying process, right? It needs to be something that's not so obviously observable. And then if it's resources, it turns out medieval England has relatively rapid rates of social mobility. The way we can observe that in medieval England is we have the complete records of, not the complete, but records of attendance at Oxford and Cambridge. There's a bunch of names in medieval England, such as Smith, where no one attended Oxford and Cambridge in 1300 because it was the name of the village blacksmith. We can just say, well, how long does it take for Smiths to become fully represented in Oxford and Cambridge? And the answer is, it's about 200, 250 years. So it's already by the 16th century, the original medieval kind of working class has made it fully into the upper echelons of English society. And that's actually a very slow process, but it's the same kind of speed that you're going to observe within the modern world, okay? But then, now with universal access to education, support for education, I mean, resources we think would become much less important. We can also look at windfall gains. So there's a nice example in the United States where in Georgia, they knew they were going to expel the Cherokee, and so they had a lottery for the farmland of the Cherokee before they even expelled them, where essentially at zero cost, every white male in Georgia could enter the lottery, and randomly a group of those males won, and you didn't even need to go and visit the piece of land, you could sell instantly. And so basically you got a ticket for almost nothing, and the equivalent in modern terms would be $160,000 relative to people's average income at that period, was the winnings of the winners in the lottery and the losers. And so Joe Ferry and a co-author have gone through the census records and figured out what happened to the descendants of the winners versus the losers in this lottery. And the answer is that their children had no greater an education than the children of the losers, and similarly their grandchildren. And the children may have had somewhat more wealth, but there's no effect even also on fertility. There's very little effect. There's a slight effect on fertility, I think, the first generation. But essentially, it doesn't change people's lives to be given something like $160,000, right, as a kind of random windfall. And then the most dramatic thing here is, well, what happens to adopted children? And there's a very nice study that's been done by Bruce Sacerdote on Korean adoptees in the United States, where a private company arranged a lot of these adoptions and nicely did it in a way where it was effectively random amongst the families, right? So once you qualified, you got on a list, and then the next baby that came through, that was allocated to that family. And so these families had income that varied at the time of adoption by a ratio of more than 20 to 1. And then this is the income as adults of the adoptees. And what you see is that the family income had no effect on the income of the children. And then this is the income of the biological children of the same families, right? And so what you see is that there is this here, but something else is transmitting this. It's not the income of the families themselves, right? And so the evidence from adoptions is, and now the evidence is not that families are completely irrelevant. And the way that Sacerdote does this in the book is since these children were randomly adopted into the families, what you can look at is what's the correlation between the adopted children, and then what's the correlation between the biological children. And the difference between those two multiplied by 2 will show you the contribution of genetics, right, on this simple model, right? And then if there's no family contribution, then there'll be no correlation between these children, right? And so you see for height that that's almost entirely genetic, right? And that shows up here for high income. For family income, there is a correlation, right? So the families are doing something in terms of generating a correlation of income, but it's not the income of the family, it's something else about the family that's generating that correlation. But what you see is that the proportion explained by genetics is about 3 times as great, the proportion of the variance that's explained by genetics. And so in these studies, it always shows that genetics is just much more important than family. 4 years of college, again, the ratio is about 3 to 1. Whether you smoke or not is very strongly genetically determined as well. But whether you drink is almost entirely socially determined, right? And so you actually see, as I say, this interesting difference in patterns. But the one thing that parents can do is they'll get you into a much better college, right? And so you can see that early in the life course, I think the evidence is early in the life course, parents can have much greater influence. But as you move later, they have less influence. And what would actually be very interesting would be to see what happens to the children of these children. Right? Does the effect just kind of disappear completely in the end of the adoptive parents, or does it persist through many generations? Because the evidence seems to be that the parents you're more likely to go to college, you're more likely to go, strongly more likely to go to a much better college, but later in the course of your life, it's actually having less influence in terms of outcomes for people. And that families are actually, so the debate here, the adoption studies just say, genetics has got to play a significant role in this process. The debate is it 50% or 100%, right? It's not, is it playing no role whatsoever, right? And so that's quite convincing. And then what are other things that would rule out biological inheritance as the main source? And so here's the various things, which I'll just go through a few of them in the time remaining. One is, if the process is not AR1, at the group level, if it's really going to be genetics, then there has to be this constant rate of movement to the mean, right? And so if there's anything about the earlier history of a group that is then predictive of a different movement, that would say that it can't just be genetics, right? Because at the group level, I'm thinking this is correct, that the genetic structure is given, right? It's all coming from the parents of that group. And so it should be this simple structure in all cases. If the intergenerational correlation differs across the status ranking, that is, if movement to the mean is different at the top compared to the bottom of the distribution, it would actually say that there must be important non-genetic components, because the parallel we would have here is that there must be the combination of many genes that's causing social status. And so it will be like height inheritance, and height inheritance has this linear characteristic, right? And so whatever's doing this, it's going to have that structure if it's going to be correct. If relatives other than the parents actually matter to outcomes, that is, your grandparents can appear to matter because we don't know the true underlying status of your parents. But in cases where we do know the true underlying status, what should happen is that no other relatives should then have any predictive ability. It should just be your parents that actually are the predictors. And then the other interesting one is maritally endogamous groups should not regress to the social mean. If a group only marries internally, it should maintain its status forever if genetics is actually the carrier of this, right? Because what will happen, so for example, the Jewish population has relatively high status in the United States. If that has a genetic origin, then what's happening is that if someone who is Jewish marries someone who is non-Jewish, even if they appear to have the same characteristics, they will typically be deviating more from the mean of their group. And there'll be a larger random component to their social status, and so that you'll actually get more regression to the mean. And whereas if you marry someone from within the Jewish group of the same status, because they're deviating less from the mean of that group, they'll systematically tend to be less random component to the social status, and so the children will do better, right? And this is a characteristic that we observe, I think, in the United States, which is that different social groups are moving. So if you have a Latino family, if they're middle class, their children are more likely to decline more towards the average than a Jewish family's children, right? And and so that's actually a very interesting test, right, of this. And then the other thing is elites and underclasses in this model are not going to necessarily be distinguished by any particular set of beliefs or cultures, right? They could have any form you like, right, in terms of beliefs. It's just that they're selected from a larger population by some process. Whole populations can't change their social status if genetics is the important thing, right? And so, for example, religious conversion will not be able to make a group of people go from being low status to high status or high status to low status, right? Because it's not changing the genetics. And then we talked already about adoptions, and then another one should be that family size should not be a significant predictor of outcomes, right? Because that's not going to change the genetics of the children. And so let's just look at a couple of these. So this is what height transmission looks like. Here's wealth across generations in Denmark, right? And as I say, what's interesting here is there are clearly deviations at the bottom and the top, but it's actually pretty close to linear for most of the distribution, right? And so as I say, this is the pattern you would want in terms of status measures. And then there's been some recent studies of income transmission in the United States, where again, they actually find this close to linearity, right? If it's normalized in the correct way, where it really just looks like a straight line, right? And it's not different at the bottom compared to the top. And the important thing I say about the wealth transmission here is the processes are very different at the bottom, right? At the bottom, you don't get any wealth from your parents. You have to accumulate it. At the top, you get wealth, and then it's how much you dissipate it. And so, as I say, these are very different social processes, but the interesting thing is that there seems to be the same rough linearity. And so here's the issue about, well, do grandparents or great-grandparents matter? And I know that in anthropology, there's been a lot of interest in grandmothers, the role of grandmothers in actually contributing to fertility and outcomes for children. And so here's a way we can examine this. And it's a little bit complicated to explain. But what we can do is we can go to Oxford and Cambridge in 1800 to 1830 and just take names that happen to be there, rare names. And then we can distinguish those rare names as there are some which weren't at the university in the previous generation. So they're more often the newcomers. And there are some which were at the university in the previous generation, so they have history. So some have a much more distinguished lineage than other, right? And so say Cornwallis would be there earlier, but other names like Basavy or something who were Jewish immigrants would not be at the university earlier. And so then we can separate these two groups and say, does the group with lineage tend to go back to the mean more slowly than the group without lineage, right? And one thing you do learn is that if they have lineage, then in the next generation, these guys are much more heavily represented, right? Because if they have lineage, you've learned that they're not just accidentally at the university, they're systematically higher status families, right? But going from that point forward, the interesting thing here is there's no difference in the rate of regression to the mean, right? They move towards the mean at exactly the same rate, and so that's meeting that condition that once we have groups where we observe this underlying X, history shouldn't matter. It's just where you are now. It doesn't matter that you had a different history. It's just your status at this moment that determines where you're going to go to. And so you don't see any clear violation there. What about persistent elites? And so, for example, the Copts in Egypt are still a social elite. They emerged as a social elite around about 700 AD. And so they've been in a social elite for something like 1,300 years, which even at these low rates of social mobility would not be possible, right? But what's characteristic of the Copts is that they don't intermarry with the Muslim population, right? And also in Muslim societies, there tends to be a rule that you can't give up the faith, and apostasy is punishable by death. You don't have to convert. And what's interesting is, how did the Copts become an elite? In these societies, there's a head tax that's imposed on non-Muslims. And so what happened was poor Copts were 98% of the population of Egypt at the time of the Arabian invasions. Poor Copts systematically converted. Rich Copts stayed Coptic. And so you had this endogenous creation of this elite within the society, and then without intermarriage, that group remained elite to the present time. And so some of the most elite people in the United States now are Coptic Christians, right, who have now been leaving Egypt in relatively large numbers. And it turns out it's true all across the Middle East that Muslims tend to be the underclass in majority Muslim societies, and with the same process where the people who don't convert tend to be the elites. And this was true in Syria, in Iraq. And again, the Jewish population in these societies again stayed elite all the way through these years. And then again, if you take, say, Eastern European Jews, the DNA evidence is that there was very little intermarriage of these groups with the resident populations in Eastern Europe. And again, you get this maintenance of relatively elite status over many, many years. And so as I say, you don't see clear cases where groups that remain endogamous, purely endogamous, will actually follow the same kind of move towards regression to the mean. And then, what distinguishes elites? And so one very simple measure of eliteness in the United States is how many doctors are there per 1,000 of different surname populations. And so as I say, the Copts turn out to be the winners. So names like Shenouda are the most elite in the United States. But the new great elite of the United States is going to be Hindu populations, because it's a much larger population. And you can see that they have 12 times as many doctors per thousand. There's about 3 per thousand in the general population, and so they have about 36 doctors per thousand. And that group is still being added to. And at current measured rates of social mobility, in the next centuries, it'll actually be Hindus who are the new elite. But what's interesting is when you look at these elites, they have every kind of religious adherence. There's also Iranian Muslims, also constitute an elite, Maronites, Jewish populations, Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos, Black Africans also constitute an elite, Greeks, Armenians. There's nothing culturally that distinguishes elites in the United States, right? What distinguishes these groups is the process of immigration to the United States and the barriers that people had to jump to actually get to the United States. And then again, in terms of the disadvantaged groups, again, it's very diverse, though it is true that it tends to be Native American populations are heavily represented. But one very interesting group here are people with Franco-American surnames are an underclass in the United States, and they're the only European population that systematically constitutes an underclass. And it's very unclear why that is, because I don't think there's much explicit discrimination against Franco-Americans, and it's quite a subtle effect. But it is actually systematically the case that all of these Franco-American surnames are underrepresented in any form of kind of elite activities, such as attorneys or doctors in the United States. And so can a whole population change social status? And so what you find, for example, is that the evidence of Jewish history is that the Jewish population now is a small fraction of a much larger original population, but a fraction that was selected as the elite of that population. That most Jews converted to Christianity sometime in the first 10 centuries, but that the ones who stayed Jewish tended to be the more educated sections of that population. And as I say again, in Muslim societies, typically these are all remnants, again, of larger populations who chose not to convert. And in Ireland, actually, also discussed in the book, is that Protestants are more elite than Catholics, typically, in Irish history, but there's actually evidence of selective conversion, that basically high-status Catholics were likely to become Protestant, and low-status Protestants were likely to become Catholic. And so you can actually see in these cases, actually, there are endogenous processes whereby the underclass group is actually recruiting from the general population and losing members to the general population. And so if you look at the gypsy or traveler population in England, the evidence again there from their surnames is that they're a representative sample of the general population. And what's actually happening is that people are being recruited into this population because it's remained very much an underclass population, but also it's very easy for people to just disappear into the general population. And another thing that's happening in this community is that the lower status travelers tend to have much higher fertility. And so the other thing that's also then kind of keeping the status of the group low is that the general regression to the mean caused by intermarriage is actually being countered by the very high fertility of the lowest status group within that population. And so you can actually see names that are characteristic of travelers in England. There are some that are actually declining in social status. They're actually moving away from the mean. And so it looks like you shouldn't be observing this on this model. But as I say, it's quite consistent with the fact that the traveler population has this much higher rate of fertility. So you got these observations are consistent. And then what about family size? And so in England, and this is actually not in the book. This is stuff we've done since then. In England from 1800 to 1880, family size seemed to be largely random. It was just a kind of exogenous shock. It's not associated with social class. And so you get a distribution in terms of adult children per father for a sample we have in this period, which is very dispersed. And so enormous differences. And here's an example of this. William IV had a mistress before he became king, Dorothea Bland, and they produced 10 children, 8 of whom survived by 1837. And Bland actually gave birth to 14 children. And she was 30 when her affair with the prince began. So she had a very strong constitution. And then in 1818, he gave up this wayward path and took up with Princess Adelaide, who was a German princess. And his wife was 25 at marriage. It was a happy union. They seemed very much in love. They produced no surviving children. And so that's why Queen Victoria came to the throne. And just kind of illustrates here that just the matching of partners could result in some cases in one child, in another case in 15 children. And so a lot of this fertility in this period seems to be random. What's the effect of that fertility? So for upper class people, one measure is how many of the sons enrolled in Oxford and Cambridge. And what you see here is that it has absolutely no effect, family size, on what fraction of the sons enroll in Oxford or Cambridge amongst these upper class families. And so you could have 11 children, you could have one child. You had roughly, the children had about the same chance of enrolling in Oxford or Cambridge. One thing that does show up is that the sons who enroll in Oxbridge have about 4 years greater life expectancy. And so it's interesting, I mean, does that reveal that they just had some better abilities in general and greater robustness? So that's interesting. And then child longevity, again, is completely independent of family size in this period. And the only thing that does get influenced by family size is there's a clear negative association between wealth and family size. And so, but the effect is very moderate, right? And the effect, this is based also, the predicted effect based on the wealth of the fathers. And so what you see is that the children of very small families tend to dissipate wealth. The children of larger families tend to accumulate wealth. And so they behave as though there's some kind of natural wealth state that they're trying to return to. And we just looked at the grandchildren, and the answer is the grandchildren show no effect of the size of the previous generation, right? So that by the time of the grandchildren, the family size of the previous generation is having no, I mean, looking at the first generation, assuming that grandchildren then are equally distributed across all cells. And so the interesting thing, as I say, is that family size doesn't seem to matter. And then the question that comes up then, well, why are no genes found that are linked to any aspect of social status? And so the argument simply has been that there's just not enough data to actually discover these individual things. That there's, we do know with height many genes that actually correlate with height, but there's medical studies have collected much more information on height than they have on people's social status. And so the argument would be that it's just, you know, there just isn't enough data to actually detect these individual genes because there don't seem to be any that people have identified. I'd be interested to know if that's, this is an explanation I heard elsewhere. I don't know if it's actually correct as an explanation. And then the conclusion is that there's very little we can do to increase the rate of social mobility. It's likely because it's mostly kind of biologically inherited. Some people take that as an incredibly depressing result. And so I've actually had people say to me, this is the most depressing book I have ever read, right? And I actually don't take it that way because I take it more as saying, look, the world is a fairer place than people imagine. We live closer to a meritocracy than people imagine, that people have certain abilities. They tend to be transmitted fairly strongly between generations. And whatever the structure of the society, there are some families who figure out how to end up in the dominant, the good positions in that society. There are some families who fail in that task. But that, you know, it's, what can you do? I mean, people tend to want to marry assortatively. If there is transmission of abilities, this is the thing that will result. And one thing that would imply is it's a very strong argument for limiting inequality in society because it's saying that at the time people are born, a huge amount is already determined, right? That incentives, all of these other things are not that important. Whatever the structure of the society, certain people will end up in the advantageous positions within the society. And the one thing we know we can work on is inequality, whereas there's very little evidence that we can change the underlying rate of social mobility. Thank you. Yep.
I mean, I do wonder if it's a given that this reflects just actual biological factors that would be conferring something that's advantageous to somebody, and how much that is just the power relations that are in place. So when I think about like my own family, for example, when my Scottish white great-grandfather married a black Jamaican woman, what ended up happening, of course, is a drop in social status for him, an increase in social status for her, and of course my family would have then created this blended heritage that, because of the nature of social relations,
Right.
would have put them in kind of like this middle status.
Right.
Right? So my Jamaican white Robertson family has continued to be more, slightly more elite and more wealthy in some ways, whereas the brown Jamaican Robertsons are a little bit in the middle to upper, and that is not just because somehow my family would have been just these geniuses in relation. It's also largely because of the power relations that would have said that this is how social mobility will work. And so if you are of a certain group, because of how these processes happen, it seems to me like this also is more, this is maybe, there might be some biological, but there's also real like social historical component.
These are very good points. I mean, I don't want to be taken as denying that there are societies where groups are explicitly oppressed and where these things matter. And so this more is saying, looking at common or garden social mobility, right? What are you going to observe, right? So for example, if you take, say, the Jewish population in Eastern Europe, that faced a lot of explicit handicaps. But what I would say is within that population, I would expect that social mobility rates would be very similar, right? But the problem is that in the society as a whole, they couldn't rise to the top as might have been possible because of those limitations. But what's interesting is that as soon as they escaped that society, then you get these very strong outcomes, right? So yeah, absolutely there are clearly societies where there's very explicit discrimination against particular groups, but it can be harder to discriminate than it's hard sometimes for societies to do this. So for example, the Jewish population in the United States faced discrimination in medical schools and in universities in the East Coast very strongly, but it really had relatively little effect on the social status of the group, because then you could go into finance, you could go to Wall Street, there were all these unrestricted areas of activity, and in the long run it actually had very little effect on the status of the group. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it will happen that there are groups where the other story comes in. But what I'm saying is, for example, if you look at English history, it matters very little. Right? If you want to describe English history, explicit discrimination against particular groups like Catholics is playing very little role in the overall pattern here. And in fact, in England, if you look at this data on social mobility rates, you can't observe any significant changes. You can't observe the Industrial Revolution, you can't observe the emancipation of women, you can't observe, the ending of feudalism. in terms of social mobility rates, the history doesn't seem to exist yet.
I was just wondering if you clarify what you have in mind when you're talking about genetic transmission of these things. So, I mean, the example that you gave of transmission of wealth between adopted and genetic kids made it sound like, so one explanation for that is that the genes themselves are not transmitting the money, but that people preferentially give money to their genetic relative.
Oh, I see.
And
No,
and so
so I
you
mean,
can say that there's a genetic
Right,
effect there, but
right.
it's not that the genes are the
Right,
mechanism of
right.
transmission.
so wealth is actually the one thing where you actually hand someone right,
Yes.
something and say,
Yeah.
here, take some money. But what's interesting there is, as I say, that the effect of being from a family of 12 compared to being a family of 1 on your final wealth is actually surprisingly small.
Yeah.
There is a disadvantage, but what it's saying is that even wealth accumulation is being driven by personality or other factors in children, right? And that advantage, is very quickly eroding in these families. And that in the long run, what seems more characteristic is that there's somehow a transmission of some generalized ability to function in the society, right? And what's interesting about these families, the English ones, so now what's happening is actually we're building up this big database. So far we have 57,000 people where we want to know the exact genealogical links going back to 1800 in England, and we want to actually make it even bigger. And then you can actually explore some of these questions about what about the lineage, and what if we put all this information in, how much better a predictor would it be, and is it really the case? For example, if your grandparents are alive at the time the grandchild was alive, does it make a difference in any way to the outcomes? If the grandparents are dead, does it make a difference? And so, lost the original point here. Yeah, so I would say what's interesting here is that it's not even a particular concentration on a particular area of the society. You actually see these families change quite dramatically where they're located. They start off as merchants, they become university professors, they go into government, they're in the army. I mean, so there's not even that strong a persistence in a particular area within the society, but there is a persistence that they're doing something that's a relatively higher status in the society.
Can I just follow? Yeah. So, I mean, it's true that money is handed from individual to individual, but if you take a case, I guess what I'm trying to wrap my head around is, I mean, one kind of model would be the Darwins have some genes that make them smart and successful and what have you, right? Another kind of model is that the Darwins have the name Darwin.
Right.
And that the children of Darwin have the genes of Darwin and the name Darwin.
And the name Darwin. But
a
large fraction of
them,
right.
I mean, that social status is indeed
right.
transmitted through the generations, and that they will see genetic correlation, but it's not because of particular genes.
Well, that might actually be a good test, but in the case of Darwin, a lot of Darwin's actually a relatively common English name, right? And then a lot of those great-great-grandchildren are not Darwins anymore, right? But people may know the connection. Right, and so it's. I mean, in an individual case like that, it's hard to rule out that there's some advantage that people are getting there. But my interpretation is that there's just some kind of generalized abilities that are being passed on, and an interesting, important thing is the male line becomes a tiny fraction of your genetic history.
Sure.
It's actually the women who are important in this story. Because the reason the peeps stayed high on the social ladder, if the story is correct, it's nothing to do with the original male peeps who founded the line. It was all the women that the peeps married. They were the ones who brought the abilities, right? And so it's all about the marriages that they're actually able to form. And that's one thing I want to emphasize here is this rate of persistence here is so high that there really has to be very highly assorted mating. Right? If there was just random mating, you couldn't have this kind of, with genetic explanation, you couldn't have this rate of persistence. And so it really has to say, another prediction of this will be, in all societies, mating has to be highly assortative, right? Or else you get much higher rates of social mobility. So that's something else we can actually test that's interesting. Yeah. Question, yeah.
I'm trying to understand that slide
Right.
that shows both the wealth history
Right.
and the wealth futures
Right.
of high social status.
Well,
rare
this
family
was the educational history and educational future, right? And so it was the fraction, it was the relative chance of people with those names attending Oxford and Cambridge, and then the implied rate of intergenerational correlation of their average educational status, right?
Right.
But that was actually, that's the one thing where we can go way back. We can also do it, by the way, with wealth. You'll get exactly the same picture, right?
Right, so if that's genetically
Right.
determined, I can imagine processes that would cause it to deteriorate but it's hard to imagine what caused it to rise. How
Right.
did those families rise?
You know, I mean, this is really it's kind of mystical, right? Because as soon as we observe the families at high status, then the decline is inevitable, right? And so it seems like, you know, did we do that, you know, by observing them? But it's not. It's actually a very different process that's going on. And so what's happening is, in the earlier generations, whoops, if I can bring it up, I can maybe illustrate it. Whoop. All the way back here. Where was the rise? Oops. Here we go. So what's happening here is, here, if you took the average families that's this position, they're headed downwards. Okay? So the average family from here they're all headed downwards. But what's happening is that a small group of families get a positive luck here and get a shock that pushes them up. And it turns out they constitute the majority of people who are at this position, right, at this time. And then again, the people who get here mostly come from this point here. So there are these twin processes going on of the pool of the average, but also the shocks that always have to come to maintain the distribution, right? And so it just turns out statistically that the process has to be that the average person who's getting to here is coming from here, right? And so all we're observing is, and what's happening is most of the people who get up here go back to the mean, right? But there's a few families who escape and go a bit higher, and then there's a few who escape and go a bit higher, and the distribution is much denser here. So you're just seeing what's the meaning of social life. Basically, it's just a series of random accidents, right? How did these families get there? They just had a series of good luck. And though in this model, a lot of that good luck is who did they marry, right? They were lucky in terms of the people they married. There were these things that just pushed them up there. And what it's saying is, in some sense, ultimately, the path through social life has no meaning, right? We're all just atoms in this social swirl, right? Where every path is possible, but there are certain systematic patterns that you'll see in this, right? And so from a kind of a Buddhist perspective, you know, there is this great oneness to the social world, right? And you just have to look at yourself and say, I just ended up in this position. I know where we're going on average, and I know where we came from on average, and that's just the nature of these processes, right?
So just a quick
Right.
follow-up then.
Right.
You're not saying that genetic quality determines your position up or down. There's a genetic factor that determines the rate at which it rises or declines.
No, I think that what I was saying is the people who are here are lucky in terms of their genetic structure, right? And what's happened is that they've been lucky in terms of accumulating favorable alleles, whatever, over the previous generations, right? They were just lucky, right? And that luck, though, typically once we start observing at this point, you see that luck has to dissipate, right? And it's all just, as I say, you know, what are we? We're the series of random accidents about inheritance of characteristics and the kind of movement through social life, and there's just no meaning to it, right? And some people find that pessimistic again, but as I say, I think of it as, you know, it's not. It's the nature of the world, right? You wouldn't worry about the fact that height is going to move on the same kind of trajectory, right? And so why should you worry about the fact that all other things are also doing that? Yeah. Sorry, question here.
Yes, in thinking about how to tap this general ability to
Right.
function, I'm wondering, at least for those people who were literate, if it'd be possible to draw a representative sample of letters and diaries and look at text usage and compare
Right.
and compare that to other people, contemporary people.
Right.
Because there are personality correlates of language use, and you can also, to some extent, measure
Right.
intelligence from natural language use, and I wonder
Right.
if it'd be possible to do that.
I mean, for the upper class guys, you could get, you know, some information about their characteristics. But I mean, the only question I have is, I mean, what would we learn, right? We just know there's certain
But your general ability
Right.
to function sounds very vague.
right, but we know. I mean, we all have colleagues, right? We know that some of them are much more effective than others, right? That it's a combination of qualities that makes them more effective. And so, I mean, so it's not surprising to me that you know, some of these traits can be inherited, and that for people who become very highly effective, it's often a quite unique combination of traits that they have, right? And then there's also completely accidental elements. I mean, who amongst us does not have a colleague where we think, how on earth did you get to this position, right? And so, you know, so all of these elements, I think we can see. I mean, it may be vague, but I think we know about these processes. Yeah. Question.
So I have two questions
Right.
that are sort of tangentially
Right.
related. So along this yellow curve,
Right.
if it is the case that at each point the next higher point is comprised largely of just some fortunate subset of
Right.
the previous grouping, if this idea of assortative mating is what's at play, then wouldn't all of them be more likely to increase into the next bracket? Like, because if you increase your status,
Right.
and there is assortative mating going on, wouldn't that mean you're more likely to marry somebody of higher status and push you toward moving upward
Right.
on that scale?
See, now the problem at the top, I mean, so we're talking about the top 1% here of education. The problem in all societies for people at the top is that top tends to be composed of a lot of people who had lucky accidents, right? Lucky accidents is the combination of genes, lucky accidents of how things work out for them. And so that even if you have perfect assortative mating, you're going to tend to match with people who have lower inherent genotypes, right? And so you're always going to return to the mean, right? Even within confined populations, say for example like the Jewish population, you're going to have exactly the same thing within that population. But it turns out that, and this is a weird thing to say, if I look at two potential partners, and I know that one partner, their parents were laborers, and the other had 5 generations of, you know, university professors, right? Even though they might look identical, what this model says is that they were likely to have very different genotypes, and that one would tend to produce children of higher social status than the other, right? And if that's all you cared about, right, then the predictions would be quite simple, right? But as I say, the interesting thing is that the top of the distribution in this model just contains a lot of people who are lucky, right? And it's impossible to eliminate that lot. So even by highly assortative mating, you're still going to have that regression to the mean.
Okay, and then
We're-
just the second question, sorry.
Make
Sorry, go
it
ahead.
short, because we're nearly at the
Okay, yeah, it'll be quick. So rather than it being social status that's being conferred, it can be like some sorts of behaviors that generally tend to produce, you know, a work ethic or something
Yeah.
that lends itself to status. So I would think that some of those behaviors, like, you know, like highly focused, obsessive, sort of,
Right.
you know, single-minded pursuit of one thing, while conferring status could also be maladaptive. Is there any evidence that you see sort of maladaptive behavior at a higher rate in these families than?
What would be very interesting is, you know, we're looking at societies like England or Sweden where, I mean, even in Sweden where it's military period, I mean, this is a warfare that's fought like General Motors makes cars, right? And where the kind of organizational abilities are very important. So what would be interesting would be a transition between a society where, for example, status, say in like the Norman conquerors of England, where a lot of status is conferred by your ability on the battlefield, to a society where commerce dominates, right? Where you could imagine that there would be an unusual, a transition then, right? But I just wonder, I mean, so one interesting case is the Hasidic Jewish communities in Israel and in New York, where status within the community is conferred in a very particular way, but you wonder what happens if that community reintegrated with the rest of the world. By obvious measures of status, they're actually very low status communities. But the interesting thing is, within those communities, it's still the case that status is conferred by the type of scholastic activities that would be highly rewarded if that community returned to secular society. And so I'd say what would be interesting would be, are there societies where status somehow emerges in different ways? It's just how tall you are. I was visiting Iceland, and there's a beach there which has 4 stones which determine how much you were paid as a fisherman. And so there was the halfling, the full, the double, you know, the treble, stuff like that. And so being a male, I immediately tried to pick up the full-size stone and failed. And then I tried to pick up the half-size stone and failed again. And so it made you realize that in Icelandic society in the 19th century, no one would have hired me, right? And you know, I would have been at the bottom of that social scale. And so what would be interesting, as I say, is could you actually see societies that went from that transition where and one of the things that you would expect, though, is education has become so much more important in our society. You would think that that could be accompanied by a period of enhanced social mobility, but there's no sign of it in the English data.
Unfortunately, we are now at the end of our
Oh, sorry.
allotted
Yeah.
time, but thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.